All right, looking at Resurrection Day. There's a definition for the resurrection. Did you know that? Very short, explanatory resurrection in the Bible. Here it is. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. There's your definition. What is the first resurrection? The 1,000 years. The 1,000 years is the resurrection. Well, I know of 1,000 years. That's the day of the Lord. That's the millennial reign of Christ. But it's also the first resurrection. It's the 1,000 years. Right? Now, some people will confuse the first resurrection and the second one. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. Only the first resurrection is blessed and holy. Okay? That's the one we're looking at. There is another resurrection that is after the day of the Lord, after the 1,000 years, at the great white throne judgment. That one is not blessed and holy. Okay? We're only looking at the righteous one. That's the first one. There's two. A righteous one and a resurrection for the wicked. Alright? The second one at the white throne judgment. Some people will make the mistake and say, oh, the first resurrection is rapture, and the second one is everybody else, Old Testament saints or whatever. I don't know where we get that idea, that God's going to, make a separate resurrection for Old Testament saints. But the first one is the only one that is holy. Okay, it's what Jesus is talking about when he says, assuredly I say to you that in the regeneration, that's the regeneration, this 1,000-year period, day of the Lord, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you have followed me, will also sit on 12 thrones, governing the 12 tribes of Israel. So, we have this regeneration, the 1,000 years, the first resurrection, the day of the Lord. It's all the same thing. Okay? Now listen to this. Here's another one of these sentences you need to listen to. All of the righteous resurrections that will ever take place except Christ has already received resurrection, okay? But all the other ones that will ever take place will happen within the confines and boundaries of this 1,000 years. The first resurrection is the 1,000 years, the regeneration, the day of the Lord, the last day of the millennial week. The millennial week is that 7,000 years. The last 1,000-year period is that Saturday, Sabbath to the Lord. And that's when the resurrection will be. And just as no one received spiritual resurrection before the day of Pentecost, did they? Did anyone receive spiritual resurrection before the day of Pentecost? No. Just as no one received spiritual resurrection before the day of Pentecost, no one will receive bodily resurrection until this last day begins, and not a minute before. This is the first resurrection, the 1,000 years, the day of the Lord. When does the day of the Lord begin? After the tribulation of those days, after the 7 years. See that? The last 3.5 years of that 7 years is great tribulation. Well, after the tribulation of those days, Christ says, then the tribes will mourn. And in Revelation 6 we learn what they're mourning about. The day of the Lord has come. Now it's here. After tribulation of those days. Okay? That's when the resurrection is. We're doing location again. Let's look at an Old Testament scripture for resurrection in Daniel. At that time Michael shall stand up, time of trouble. At that time your people will be delivered, everyone is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. That's resurrection. Some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Everlasting life part are the wise. Shame and contempt are the foolish virgins. Okay, but when is that awakening is what we're after here. It's after the time of trouble. Here it is again in the Old Testament. After the time of trouble, then we have an awakening or a resurrection. Some to everlasting life, some to shame. Okay? So the location of it, alright? That 1,000 years, the last day of the millennial week, the day of the Lord, the Sabbath day, the Saturday of God's program, is the resurrection. That's when He has designed for it to begin to happen. If we're trying to have a pre-7-year resurrection for us, that'd be before the 1,000 years, and that can't be. The resurrection is the 1,000 years. Timing is important. It's not as important as your relationship with Christ. In fact, you can have all of this wrong. We could be totally wrong on the timing of when Christ is coming, but as long as in our hearts we are serving Him and He is our God, and we are resisting temptation and living for Him, we can have everything else wrong and still make it to heaven and be fine. Okay? I want you to understand that. Then why are we doing this? Because knowing God's program, His timing, will help us or help those in the future to know what's going to happen before He comes, and that gives us comfort. It makes us feel a little better about what we're going through if we know, well, Jesus said this would happen first. Imagine if you didn't know all the things that would happen first, or you were confused about the timing. It's just so comforting to know what Jesus says and have the list in Matthew 24. Let's go on. See, there's the great white throne judgment. But let's look at the last day in resurrection in the next video.